My name is John Toews. I am the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers in Winnipeg. Welcome to the second episode of The Life of a Book from the Association of Manitoba Book Publishers. The goal is, naturally, to reveal the stories behind the making of the book. We're broadcasting tonight from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation, as we strive ourselves to move forward in collaboration with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation. We're joined tonight by Gregory Chomichuk, and we'll be discussing his book, Automatic Age, published by Yellow Dog. GMB Chomichuk is an award-winning writer and illustrator whose work has appeared in film, television, books, comics, and graphic novels. His work ranges from the heartwarming to the blood-curdling, with graphic novels like Cassie and Tonk, Dragon Nanny, Midnight City, Will I See, and the forthcoming The Eye Collector via Heavy Metal, in addition to Arena City. He is the host of the Super Pulp Science, a podcast about how genre gets made. His newest full-length graphic novel, Apocrypha, The Legend of Baby Metal, was featured on The Hollywood Reporter, The Nerdist, and Billboard magazine. Gregory is someone who is intimately aware of the publishing process, both from a creative and a professional standpoint, so this promises to be quite an informative and insightful conversation. His latest book, The Automatic Age, is the story of a father and son navigating an automated apocalypse. From a seeming utopia, an automated paradise designed for the maximum comfort of humans has turned into a world occupied largely by robot search teams primed to remove the troublesome human beings, haunting its hermetically clean streets. The work follows two of the few surviving humans, Kieran and his young son, Barry. Gregory's always been very forthcoming about his process and about working as a multidisciplinary creative in the publishing world. So I'd like to start the conversation by welcoming you, first of all, Greg.
Thanks for having me, John.
And I'd like to kind of follow this conversation and take it from the heights of inspiration to the nuts and bolts of publishing, which can be art in its own right.
Sure.
So I'd like to begin right at the beginning, if you don't mind, by discussing your process and the process that went into this book. What was the original seed for Automatic Age?
Actually, the original seed for Automatic Age is not too far out of reach. These aren't them specifically, but I do happen to have the newest crop. I'm a big fan of the old pulps. So I have on my desk right now a bunch of, I have an old Science Stories, an old Popular Mechanics, a old and pretty weather-beaten copy of Science Fiction, and of course, everybody's favorite Super Science Stories. So they're nobody's favorite anymore, honestly. But the thing about these old books is that they're these collections of very short novella length one and done adventures that sort of take you completely into a world and then let you imagine everything that comes after it. And so I really love that format of short stories that can be complete and of their own. And it's actually informed by something very specific from the I guess the world before. What do we call it now? When we used to be able to meet in person? The Land Before Time? No, that one has dinosaurs in it. But I used to take a lot of flights. And my absolute favorite thing to do on a plane was to read a novel that was short enough that I could start it in line in security and finish it before I debarked the plane. So just a complete escape capsule. That was sort of like a life raft while I was in the air. If anyone who has been traveling in the modern comforts of air travel have recognized that none of them are that comfortable. So the book is the perfect escape. And so these kinds of things were sort of like the form, but then the story I wanted to tell really started as a short story that I wrote about this is, now we're going pretty far afield now that I think about it. It was about an evil toy, like a clockwork toy that was just running amok. And I didn't like anything about the story except the clockwork innards of the toy itself. And then I took that piece, combined it with another story that was sort of like the failed husk of another story where a father and son were on the run from something. And I said, oh, what if this is what's chasing them? And then I happened to be staring at a stack of those old Super Science magazines. And I was like, oh yeah, the future that they promised us doesn't come true. And all of these things kind of start to swirl around into a story for me.
And you've made some interesting comments in the past as well about the fact that you're leery of science fiction that's overly nostalgic for the past, but also simultaneously overly nostalgic for some kind of envisioned utopic future, and how the present itself is more representative of science fiction than anything else. Could you chat about that a little bit?
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, nobody writes a book in anywhere but the present. Whenever you're sitting down to write, it's now. So you can imagine the future and you can remember the past, but the thing you're writing is now. And so it should be made of now, right? And so when I sat down to write Automatic Age, it was really what was going on in my life was some of the relationship with my own father, some of my relationship I had with my own children. It was all of these things, the things you sometimes are afraid you won't get to say. And sometimes the things you're afraid you won't get to hear from your own parent. And I kind of wrapped all those things up into this story. And I've said in other places, you know, one of the tangible inspirations of the main character, Kieran's prosthetics, he has 2 prosthetic legs, is, you know, my father also, I grew up in a house where having a prosthetic limb was just as normal as not having one. And so I wanted to write something where that was a function of the story, but not even a weakness or a strength, just a facet of the storytelling, just something normal, you know, something they would have to deal with as much as they had to deal with any of the other problems that were going on.
No, absolutely. Were there any, when it came to actually envisioning the world, and what I find most fascinating about your book is that it very much starts in media res. You don't focus as much on world building, you more allow the reader to naturally discover the world as it comes across. You're almost learning about it with Kieran and with Barry as they run along. And you also have a really fascinating way of using your own art as a way of directly contributing to the story itself, advancing and expanding the world without necessarily having to go into great detail about backstory or location necessarily. And I was wondering how, when the project was first conceived in your mind, did you always have that idea that it was going to be a naturally symbiotic relationship between the text and the illustrations, and they'd complement one another so directly?
You know, it's really nice of you to say that it starts in medias res and that we don't need to see or hear all of those things. But I have notebooks full of all the things that I eventually cut out of what was necessary in this story. You know, so actually, by way of example, I can spin my camera around here and I can show you some of the original notebook where this started here. So now we're on my desk. Every good notebook should be covered with some Jack Kirby art. So that's what I did with mine here. But inside this book, I'll just shift it a little so that the glare, there we go. So the glare's not quite so front and center. So I'll do, you know, illustrations of what, say, power armor will look like. This is never really focused on in the story. I might do a breakdown of what the conversation will look like between a piece of technology or the layout of a character speaking to another. Now, these things all ended up showing up in the prose and not in the book itself. I might think of what the titles of forthcoming stories might be, and this was actually the original cover doodle that became the actual cover. Those of you obsessed with negative space can see here, I flipped it around and I put the little wasp in there, but this is the idea that started early. And so these things that were illustrations that were very well defined when the book was finished, as a way of sort of polishing it, began as these very rough, very sort of rudimentary just explorations of what that might look like. And then I tended to steer away from some of those images. Sometimes drawing a thing tells you what shouldn't be in the book, at least for me. And I did a ton of world building for technology that never appeared in the story, action sequences that were not necessary in the story, all manner of hemiphilia that, in order to think about the book, I would just doodle along the way. And then when I would sort of have some ideas, I would take that to the keyboard. And then with those ideas sort of fresh in my mind, I would then approach the prose in that way. And sometimes whatever I forgot about in my drawings, when I was translating it into prose, I would just leave out then. That was gone. If it didn't stick, if it couldn't survive from here to here, then I didn't need it. It was sort of how I approached some of that. And then when I went back through the story, images like the automat or images like what the city looks like at a distance, those things kind of, I needed to establish that tone, right? The loneliness of a dried up corpse, right? Those things, what they really looked like, because the design would inform the world, right? When you see how a finished building is made or how a button works, it really informs you on what shape that future took, right? Because I was focused quite specifically on a future that was promised that never happened, you know, like the future that they were imagining in the 50s that we never quite got. Because our technology just didn't evolve in that direction. So I imagine what would happen if that aesthetic, right, lingered. And of course, one of the physical objects in the story that the boy carries around is an old fairy tale book, which is, you know, indicative of the fairy tale, not only that he's wants to believe in, but the fairy tale of the future that the characters are, in fact, inhabiting. You know, all of these old science books of mine, these things became fairy tales, right? And science didn't do this. We never got any of these versions of the future. These were just the ones that people were trying to convince us would be real. Even magazines that were about real science mostly got it wrong. And I just found that so fascinating, you know, like, and so I took all of these failed inventions and made them real things in Automatic Age.
That's what I found really fascinating about was that just ultimately in a rush to try to recapture this utopia that never was, humanity has essentially doomed itself by not thinking through the ramifications. And I also did love the fact that it's good to hear that so much, or I'm not surprised to hear that so much thought went into it, because when the world does appear in the book, it feels very lived in and natural. It doesn't feel like an afterthought that you're setting it in. There's that incredibly, and I'm pleased you kind of skim by it quickly, that moment where Kieran and Barry are on the run in the tube station. And suddenly you go from the text just suddenly being propelled alongside them through these corridors and out the other end. And it just adds this incredibly propulsive moment to the book that it would be so difficult to convey simply with text.
Well, you know, the thing was when I first started, I said, okay, I'm just going to make a prose story, right? That's what I'm working on. And then the more I wrote, the more I realized that, you know, if you were a guitar player who could also sing, why wouldn't you do both on your album? Kind of came across to me is that I could show some things that I didn't have to tell. And what's different in Automatic Age, say, than a book that has what we would call in the business spot illustrations, is that the pages that are illustrative in Automatic Age are not inserts. They're the next page of the story. If you skip them, you actually lose details. How Hearthole, the sort of big menacing robot, finds out where Barry is hidden in one of those illustrations. The actual clue that the robot is following is there for you to see. So when they're surprised, how did he find us? You don't have to be as a reader. You can look for that little fingerprint on the glass and find out how he found them.
Exactly. You've had that looming sense of dread over your shoulder the whole time.
Right. But I mean, there was a looming sense of dread for me in making it because these are not done things, typically speaking. Your book is either one thing or another often. And the world of comics, which I come from, most of my publications are there, are so caught up in the amalgamation and the juxtaposition of word and image that I just figured if it wasn't broke, don't fix it.
No, absolutely. Moving a little bit from the creative to the publishing aspect of it. Now, you're published via Yellow Dog, who's a subsidiary of the local publisher Great Plains Publications, and they publish contemporary and historical fiction for middle grade, teen, and new adult audiences. And I was wondering if you had a particular audience in mind when you set out with this story, or if it was just a story that naturally occurred to you and there came a point where you realized that it might potentially fit with that line.
So there's a textbook answer to this question, but I think a more honest one is probably do the world that we live in now. A lot of people will say you should pick the genre that you write in and you should specialize in that thing. Know your audience, study your audience, do those things for that audience. But I'm not a person who writes for just one audience. And stories occur to me that are sometimes for adults, and so I seek an adult audience for those stories. Sometimes stories occur to me that would be perfect for a 5-year-old to enjoy, and so I seek collaborators and publishers for those projects separately. With Automatic Age, once it was finished, like the draft I submitted to the publisher, I realized that it was the most YA thing I'd ever written. But I didn't set out to write a YA book. I was sort of in a position where I have lots of things and I could decide what parts to change to make it better fit the market. So a better way to elaborate on that would be to say that there is a book, physical book has a purpose. The purpose of this object is right here on the barcode with the price. The purpose of this object is to generate enough revenue to make its existence moving through the publishing world to a shelf somewhere justified. That's never the reason to write a book. The reason to write a book is always very separate from the purpose that a book gets published. And so I try to ignore the purpose of publishing when I'm writing. I just focus on the reason to make it. I want to write a book that says what I want to say about my relationship and the imagined relationships I had or didn't have with my father or my own children. That's my reason for sitting down every day, is to explore those things. Because writing should be self-archaeology. It's of the now, but it's you that you're digging into. And then when it existed, you go looking for different ways to find a reason for it to exist in the real world. And not every story does. Sometimes you wrote it just to write it and you try to shop it around, and that's as far as it can go. And I was lucky in the fact that the publisher right here in my own city, when I showed them the manuscript, they said, this is an experiment we'd like to get into, young adult stories that are a little more experimental, that maybe push a few buttons that we're not used to pushing as a publisher. If you're willing to partner with us and keep that target in mind, then come on board. And when the reasons and the purposes overlap just a little bit, that little space in the Venn diagram, those are the parts you're happy to change on behalf of the publisher, because it's not that much, right? There was a few scenes that were maybe arguably too violent for a YA book, but that's no problem. You just take out, it's literally changing a verb or two or changing a description or two, and suddenly it steps back from that precipice. And then with the illustrations also, once you decide who your audience is, you make an adjustment, because in an illustration, you can't unsee it. So for example, if you read something truly horrible in a book, your brain protects you from anything too bad, because you can only imagine it to the limit that your brain can imagine it to, right? If I say the monster devours John and only half of him is left, your brain will only let you imagine up to the point that you could handle seeing that image. But once you put an image in a book, it can't be unseen, and it can leap past what you're prepared to do. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what to show and what not to show. And there's a reason why, there's, an image or two of a shrouded corpse in the book, but they're no worse than anything you would find in National Geographic rather than in, say, a, graphic novel. So these were considerations for how to plan for it to reach the shelf.
And I was going to ask about the process of, so did you approach Yellow Dog themselves with the idea? And if so, how fully formed was the book when you approached them? Was it mostly done? Was it still an idea and primarily notes, or?
It was finished. The story was finished.
Right.
What we changed and added to the story fell under editorial direction. So I had already written the novel, and I had a number of illustrations that went with it. And I approached them with this idea that it could be a series of, sipping books, essentially, something that you could sit down on a plane, you could read the whole thing, you could get in and out. Maybe you stay home sick one day, right, from school. You could read the whole thing, and anything that you missed or you found obscure, you could go back, and using the illustrations, those could be your places where you go back in and take another sip of the story and see what you missed. Having it illustrated along certain lines allows you to revisit your favorite parts very easily because they're punctuated. You know exactly the timeline of the story. And one of the things I've liked the most about some of the reviews and people, first readers, is they were finished reading it and then went back and clarified parts. So like, oh, I went back to see what this was about, or I wondered, is this what you meant by that? And the illustrations gave them that touchstone to know exactly where they were in the novel without having to look too deeply, which was not an intentional design element, but it's definitely one I've been considering in the sequels.
No, that makes a lot of sense. The prose itself is very spare and suggestive, which is quite interesting. And the thing I particularly liked about the illustrations is, although they say so much about the world and about the story, they don't necessarily completely tie your imagination down. There's still little flashes of the action, flashes of perhaps the past. And one of the things I particularly loved was the fact that the past is touched on, but not in a great deal of detail. It's there, it's suggestive, it gives a real emotional core to the central relationship, but at the same time, you're not deluged with world building or backstory necessarily. It feels very organic as it comes along.
That's a moment I'd like to give credit to. He doesn't even know, and he wouldn't know my name to hear it, but Mike Mignola, the author of the Hellboy universe, about 15 years ago, I had a conversation with him at San Diego Comic-Con where he was reviewing illustrations, spot illustrations he had done for a book. It was probably the Baltimore novels at that time. But anyway, the point was he was lamenting at the difficulty in never giving away an element of the plot to a casual observer with the illustrations that go into a book that's mostly words. And that's haunted me. Like, he was really specific in his lament of how difficult that was. And so that is kind of, the ghost of that has followed me low these many years. And when I sat down to work on this, it was definitely present with me to reveal things, but that would be interesting to a casual flip through. Oh, look, robots. Oh, look, mech suits. Oh, look, jet guns. Oh, look, skyscrapers. But not, oh, look, here's the key element of the plot laid bare. Right. So.
And so, given your own design and illustration background, how involved were you in the layout process of the book itself? Did you work closely with, there's a local designer, Relish New Brand Experience, who worked on the design for the book. How closely did you work with them as the book was nearing completion?
Well, in the interest of full disclosure, I had laid out the book myself, and I was so convinced of its unassailable perfection that when it went to another design, when they said, well, we work with this other design house and they may want to make some changes, I was like, how dare you? This is my book. I do this all the time. And instead, when it came back, I was like, oh shoot, that's way better. They were very. There's an old saying in making art that the last 10% of any composition should take about 90% of the time. And that's what they did. They came in and they made that last 10% really mesh so much more beautifully than I had. I thought I'd had a perfect vision of what the book should be. And it just goes to show that no matter how convinced you are of your own abilities, there's always someone who's probably done it more often and with a little more practice and understands the actual form a little better than you. And particularly in my case, because I'd never done a book like this, I just was convinced I could. So full props to them for making all kinds of changes that I originally disagreed with, and then came to recognize were the absolute best solutions. So good job, Relish.
No, it is a very, very handsome looking book. And I was wondering about one thing, to get into the weeds a little bit in terms of the publishing and publicity process. I imagine this book almost fell perfectly on the cusp of moving from coronavirus being something in the background to something that was all encompassing. I believe it arrived at our store on the 8th of April originally, so literally just after we had locked down. So I was wondering how the publicity conversation on your side and with Great Plains shifted between the excitement initially and then very much and quickly adjusting to this new environment.
Well, I can tell you that it went from having 30 events planned personally in 30 different cities to having 0 events planned in 0 cities. So that conversation went from, hooray, this book is going to be so great to promote and we're going to connect it to so much of your travel and promotion already. You're already doing all these things. We're going to do some things. It was going to be this wonderful synthesis of what they were good at doing and what I was good at doing. And instead, the entire world closed. And so here we are in our respective abodes talking about a book. And that's part of the way that we're getting the word out. It's not an easy feat. It's not an easy feat to promote something new to people in a time when you need comfort, you go to the things you recognize, right? People in crisis go to the things they recognize. I mean, I reread a lot of my favorite books from my own shelves during the pandemic because they were like old friends. And so trying to let a new friend into your house in a crisis is tricky. So it's ongoing. It has changed what the normal trajectory of promoting a book would be, the normal attention span that is required by the audience to find out that there's a new book. And really, until the world opens again, it's almost like a limbo for this book in particular, where until I can get myself on the road or get myself in front of large groups again, it kind of is in a nebulous place. Young adult books are the best when you can visit schools and you can visit cities and you can visit bookstores all over. When you can't do those things, it's very difficult to promote a new work.
And you're someone who's always been very tied into the communal aspect of making art, making comics, working together with people, both in a direct one-on-one capacity, serving as an illustrator for other writers or working or vice versa, but also just basically engaging with the world of art in general and heading out to cons constantly. Given that I always notice, even in the most noirish and horrific of your work, something like Infinitum or Midnight City, there's always a touch of optimism to them. It never descends into pure nihilism. So where are you finding that optimism and community amidst all of this right now?
Well, we're talking over it right now. The technology is finally making good on its promise of connecting us instead of distancing us. There was always this promise that technology would bring us together. And instead, smartphones became a way to advertise right to our faces all the time and to mesmerize us with their phantasmagoria of products and distractions. And we stopped connecting to each other for a good while. And now that no one can go anywhere, we crave the real content. No more Facebook, but face to Facebook is what we want. And I've found that has made it very made people very willing to connect like we're connecting now. Made people more willing to adjust their schedule to regular meetings that are digital, and that's been nice. But I still collaborate. I have 4 different projects on the go right now with different groups of collaborators, and yes, it's very difficult. But in some ways, it's much easier. Remember the Jetsons, John? Do you remember the Jetsons?
Absolutely.
Okay, so in the Jetsons, when I was watching it as a kid, and I mean, let's face it, this is like, what if the Jetsons went bad and Rosie just came at you with that knife instead? But in the Jetsons, they would always take these video calls, right? And as soon as we had video call technology, nobody wanted to use it, right? Nobody wanted to use it. We needed like something bad to happen to remember that faces were useful and nice and great. And it doesn't matter what our hair looks like or how crooked our mustaches are. We could just see each other face to face. So those things have been great. And I will have some afternoons, 3 or 4 hours where I talk to 3 or 4 groups in 3 or 4 cities. And I used to have to do that on an airplane. And now I can do it all from, my home library. So there are some things I actually hope don't change back, should we get through to the other side of this.
No, that's true. Our own local communities have also grown exponentially as a result of that. I know just from our own personal experience at the store, just having people be able to attend and really come together from across the country really seems to make all the difference in the world as well, and really does serve to forge those connections that are just, rather than letting them languish amidst all this.
Yeah, I miss the store though, John. I have to tell you, like, not being able to do a launch at McNally Robertson. It sounds so silly in a way, but it's one of my favorite things about being an author is the way that in Winnipeg, we have this little place where people from all over will come. And I mean, like all over our community or province, and they'll show up for a book they've never heard of just because there's a launch at McNally. And I can't tell you the number of times we've had book launches there where 4 or 5 or maybe 10 people from the crowd will come up and say, yeah, I just happened to be in the store and heard you guys talking. So I sat down and I watched it, and it's so much the fabric of what a living arts community is to have a place to meet in person. And so that I have been missing terribly is the random acts of connection that occur. I have to be a lot more specific about how I reach people now. It's one of the things I'm missing is the way that I used to accidentally reach people.
No, absolutely. There is something very much missing about that energy, and just somebody happening to wander through the store and see your incredible array of art and the visual. I know that yourself and one of your partners, Justin, whenever you were at the store, would always have this incredible array of a screen, a projector, bright colors, incredible illustrations everywhere. And it is very much that energy and almost the creation of independent environments that I'm pleased that we can somewhat replicate online like this. And even
a little bit.
But even the ability to, one of the things that I do enjoy about this is the ability to do things like look through your notebooks and look closely see the environment in which you create as well. And I think that's one of those aspects that I have enjoyed, even though I very deeply miss the one-on-one aspect of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. But also, if I make an aside, I've gotten, actually, it's not announced yet, so I probably shouldn't say her name, but there's an author that you will know well. Her books have stalked your shelves deeply and moved many, many copies, who's become a friend over the last couple of years and reaching out, trying new media. Like the fact that we can't tour means that you have this time to try other things. And so one thing that I just opened the email 2 days ago, and it warmed my heart for this person who does not need anyone's help with anything from my perspective. Emailing me and saying, I'm working on this comic script. I've never done that before. How do I do this? How do I do that? And I said, after a year or two at the top of the New York Times bestseller list, I don't know if you need my help with anything. But that's what people are now, is that they're just willing to try and ask and reach out. And, you know, we've all been humbled a little bit by this experience. And it gives us the opportunity to share what we can do, which is really all we can do, is share what we can do. And I think if I have any optimism left, that's where it's coming from, is that I spend part of my day with people who I am the mentor to. I spend part of my day with people who are my peers, who are struggling to accomplish the same things. And I spend part of my day talking to people who I revere, I look up to, and I try to learn as much as I can from them. So that keeps the great wheel of self turning in the right direction.
No, that's fantastic to hear. And it seems particularly appropriate that so much of your work is concerned with just almost the telescope stories of small individuals going up against seemingly just unbeatable or overwhelming circumstances and somehow finding a way through. So it seems very appropriate for these incredibly uncertain times to have books like Automatic Age on board.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So I'm going to wind things down a little bit right now. I believe we're just headed toward the end of our conversation, but I did, given the theme of this evening and AMBP's Life of the Book idea, I was wondering where this book is going next and where the series itself is headed and what you envision for the future immediately.
So when we pitched, when I pitched Automatic Age, I pitched it as the first of a set of books that were connected, but could be discovered separately. Inspired very much by, if I point at the right part behind me, this way, there we go. Everything's flipped in the camera. Like an old collection of Conan books that I have, the old pulps. I read them out of order, but it didn't spoil my relishing the world that the characters inhabited. You knew the main character is not likely to die in the book. Let's face it. If it's a series, you know the main character is going to live along the way. Spoiler alert in most cases. But I loved the idea that we could create a series of books that if you read them out of order, it would deepen a good mystery instead of add to confusion. And so the sequel to Automatic Age is called The Backbone of Night. And it's lovingly titled, it shares a title with one of my favorite episodes of Carl Sagan's Cosmos. And it is the linear sequel to the story of the Automatic Age, but it is, in my mind, the emotional prequel. Once these characters learn what they have to learn in this book, they find a character who is not yet at their level that needs to be shown what they've already learned. Kind of like what we're doing now, right? You get through something awful and then you try to find someone to help. And so it's no secret. I mean, you learn it in the first chapter of the Automatic Age that they're not the last survivors. They're just not that many left. And they survive largely because they have themselves as companions. And what do you do when you're utterly alone? What choices do you make that are different? And the writing of Backbone of Night has changed a lot. My draft changed a lot after the pandemic. My imagined concept of utter loneliness versus my practical application of real life loneliness made the draft very different, but I think much stronger for it because we write books today. We write them where we are, right? We imagine a future. So it has it ramps up the action, I would say, a little bit more than the Automatic Age has, and the Automatic Age has a lot, but it also raises the emotional stakes, I think, quite a bit.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us here tonight to talk about your book, for serving as a central lightning rod and bringing the past and the future together in our present and sharing these stories in such an incredibly immersive and invigorating way. It's The Automatic Age by GMB Chomichuk, published by Yellow Dog, available in fine stores across the country and beyond. And I'd like to thank you out there on the internet for watching it and joining us in community as we talk about creative challenges and inspiration amidst these times. And also extend my gratitude to the Association of Manitoba Book Publishers for helping to put this on. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Keep reading.